我先自我介绍一下，我叫周杰，我是 Google 的一名技术总监。今天呢是由我来负责主持 Linux 和开源部分的讨论。开源运动和 Linux 运动在最近这几年蓬勃发展得非常快。然后 Google 作为整个开源运动的最大的受益者之一，也是开源运动的重要推动者之一。然后中国在开源项目和 Linux 项目上面都非常重视。我们的话呢，也是希望借这样的一个活动，能够推动整个开源运动在中国的蓬勃发展。另外 ，Google 中国在产品线上边的话，也会对开源运动给予进一步的支持。今天我们主要会有四个演讲和一个专题讨论。每个演讲是1个小时，其中有45分钟是演讲部分，另外还有15分钟最后是为大家提供提问的时间。我们的语言主要会用英语。然后在大家提问的时候啊，可以用英语，也可以用中文。然后用中文的话，我会来帮助翻译一下。So now let's get started. So our first speech will be about Google and open source. As you know, like Google is a big beneficiary of the open source activities, and also Google is a big contributor to the open source society. As our founder Larry Page said, in Google, every engineer use Linux. It's free, and you can hack on it. It's deep in our DNA. So today we have Jon from our open source team to present you about the Google strategy on open source. Jon is a very experienced open source developer. Prior to joining Google, he worked in Novell and Ximian, and he tackled a lot of open source projects, including the Linux desktop search tool, Beagle. So now we have Jon.
Hi everyone. Okay, if you can hear me, wave your arms over your head. Okay, not all of you waved your arms over your head, but some of you in the back did. So I'm going to assume it's okay. So, well, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to Developer Day today. Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here. This is my first visit to China. I'm very excited to be in Beijing and meet many Chinese people who are interested in open source. So I'm going to repeat now what you just heard, just so you know, who am I? Why should you spend an hour of your life or 50 minutes of your life listening to me talk? I think the first thing I just want to say about myself is that, oh, I have a cursor too. Let me, yeah. Okay. I guess the first thing I want to say about myself is I'm an engineer. Sometimes if you come to things like this for big companies, the people you talk to or people who talk to you are people whose job is to talk to people for a living. My job is not to talk to people for a living, it's to sit in front of the computer for a living. And that's, I think, one of the really nice things about Developer Day is I think almost all of the people who are going to be talking today are actual developers and engineers and not business people or, evangelists or people whose job it is just to go around and talk. So yeah, I'm a member of Google's open source program office, and what that is it's basically the division inside of Google that sort of coordinates our open source activities, both in terms of talking to the outside world and helping Google sort of do the right thing and not be evil regarding open source, and also we work internally because we use so much open source software inside of Google, and helping engineers with that, and helping engineers who want to release code. I've been at Google since the beginning of 2006. I've been using open source software for a long time, since before they called it open source software, back when it was free software. I've been using this before there was Linux. I think it was, I remember in 1985 reading the article where Richard Stallman said he was going to make a free Unix off his own, and at the time thinking, that would be cool, but I don't think it'll ever going to work. But luckily Richard Stallman did not have me there to tell him no, and he kept going, and we have open source software today. So, as you heard, I've worked at Ximian and Novell working on building Linux desktop applications. So, I write code. That's what I do. And I still, we do lots of open source stuff, but at Google, I write code. So, again, there's this great quote that was so nice from Larry Page recently, and about how he's saying that Linux is in the DNA of the company. It's nice to see, someone at the very top of the company clearly understands Linux and understands the importance of Linux to Google. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to tell you a little bit about why this is true, in what sense Linux is in the DNA of Google. Then I'm going to talk to you about some of the things we're doing around open source in terms of code and trying to help open source. And then what I really want to do is, like I said, I don't talk for a living, so I don't really want to stand up here for 57 more minutes and talk to you. What I really want to do is I'm hoping people will be a lot of time for questions at the end, and if you have questions during the talk, you're allowed to interrupt me. And if you're not if you don't want to ask a question in English because you're nervous about that, you can write down your question and give it to over here, and then we read it. We have translation. So one way or another, regardless of any language barriers, I'm sure we can find a way to talk to each other. So please interrupt me if you want to. So well, let's look at these pictures we love. The Google Family Album. There it is. That's Google right there. That's about 1996 in Stanford. It's just the pile. This is what Larry and Sergey, their pile of computers where they built their first prototype Google search engine. Now, one interesting thing about this, besides it being messy and chaotic, is this is also the last time that there was a heterogeneous computing platform. All the computers weren't Linux. Okay, I keep bumping the volume there. So, what they do, the way they got these computers is they were students at the time, so they would just walk around. I think they had a few computers, but they kept needing more and more and more. So they would sort of walk around Stanford, and they would see like a computer sitting in an office, and then maybe they go back a few days later, and if no one had moved it, they would take it and hope no one noticed, and add it to their little pile of random computers. So if you look carefully, there's a few Sun machines in here, but it's mostly Linux boxes at this point. But now, basically after this, everything's Linux. We have some non-Linux machines, we use for highly specialized things, but they're a tiny, tiny little fraction of the computing resources that Google uses. So this is kind of the interesting thing, is that Google is responsible for creating lots of Linux users. My mother is now a Linux user, which I never thought would happen. And she doesn't know she's a Linux user, but she uses Gmail and she uses web search. And every time she types something in, these Linux computers light up in a data center somewhere and send back the results. So, the one thing I want to point out here is, I don't know if you've seen our super high-tech disk case here built out of the Legos. So luckily we're a little bit more sophisticated in our industrial engineering now than this, but still not really so much, because our computers are kind of cobbled together. They're designed to be as cheap and simple as possible. So we move ahead a few years and we get this exotic piece of high-tech computing. It's just a rack of cheap Linux machines, all wired together with wires hanging everywhere. I think this is actually one of the first racks. And if you're ever in the United States, in Boston, there's a wonderful, it's not in Boston anymore, it used to be in Boston, it's in Mountain View now, I forgot. In Mountain View is the Computer History Museum. You can actually see this rack, which is the first Google rack, with all sorts of other, they have like a PDP-11 that works. You can actually play Space War on it, it's pretty cool. So if you're ever in California, I definitely recommend the Computer History Museum. So, we sort of go from this chaotic thing, again, running just Linux. Then we got these, we're getting bigger and fancier, but still notice the extremely high-tech data center cooling system we have here. So this is really what we've done. Basically, one of the things that Google is best at, and I think sort of the secret of their success in many ways, is they figured out early how to just take a lot of Linux computers and string them together very efficiently in a very custom platform to do the kinds of things they need to do that Joe was talking about earlier, about the hardware and the stack and all of that. So then we got pretty sophisticated after a while, right? This is many years ago, right? Still, you start with this, and then if you look at the timestamps on the photos, 24 hours later, you have that. You just roll in the servers, wire them all together, and boom, you have a data center. That's a lot of work. I'm happy I didn't have to do that. So this is the Google philosophy of computing, right? Which is that PCs are cheap and fast. PCs are also unreliable. They break. My computer breaks and I just have one, right? When you have 1,000 computers, then there's one's going to break every day probably. But they're cheap, and you can just, if you have enough of them, and if you can sort of set up your software to accommodate the fact that your computer is going to break every now and then it works out really, really well. And a lot of the success of Google is due to, I think, understanding this early and being able to take advantage of it. So, and this is really why Linux is the DNA of Google, because it's the beating heart in the middle of our computing clusters. And really, Google would not have been possible if Linux hadn't existed, or it would have, Google as we know it today would not be possible. It would have taken on a very different form. So the reason we love Linux, it's because it's the ideal platform for innovation. You can hack on it. They took a very different approach to computing. I mean, at that time, in the late 90s, during the internet bubble, say you were setting up a website. You wouldn't do this at all. What you'd do is you'd take a bunch of money, you'd buy a bunch of extremely expensive servers that never break, and that's how you would approach things. So this was sort of the opposite of that approach, to buy a lot of cheap things that have a lot more computing power for the same money than the one big thing. Oh, we have a question already. Okay.
另外大家说一下，就是今天我们前5名问问题的人会有奖品。
Okay. Yes, the question is there a Google operating system? And is it open source? Well, I guess the answer is yes, because the Google operating system is Linux. And Linux is open source. So obviously, what we run on our computers is a sort of highly optimized, fine-tuned, customized version of Linux, but it's not really that different. It's not fundamentally different than the Linux that you can run on your computers at home. And we strive to make it less different just because that's better for us, right? We want to be able to take advantage of the improvements that the outside world make to Linux so we can benefit from that in our data centers. And likewise, we try to push our things out. Oh, more questions. This is great. Okay. Okay, this is a very broad question. It's what is business value for Google in Linux and open source? What is strategy of Google in Linux and open source? This is a little too broad to answer quickly. I'm going to get to this. Whoever asked this question, let me talk a little bit longer. And if you don't think I've answered it, then you can ask the question again. Oh, this is great. Okay, what have we got here? How does Google organize the massive data using free software? Some tools. Well, what we do is the way we organize the data, again, Shiv was talking, we have GFS and Bigtable and tools like that, which are software that sit on top of Linux. But Linux is at the very core. These are all Linux applications. They're Unix applications that tie into Linux. So those are different applications, and those are not open source, unfortunately. We can talk about why they are in a little bit. Oh. Okay. Which distribution of Linux is used in Google? Do you make Google Linux for yourself? Well, what we do is we don't actually, all the engineers on our workstations that sit on our desks, we run a modified version of Ubuntu, which we call Goobuntu as a joke. But this is not, sometimes people say, oh, is Google going to release an operating system for desktops? No, it's just, we just took Ubuntu and modified it for our own use. A lot of companies do this. They will take an existing distro and then just modify and put, add custom configuration. So we try to, we don't diverge very far from Ubuntu. And then the Linux we run in the data center, that's just a custom distribution list that we put down ourselves. Okay, many questions. This is good. This is good. Cluster network is slow. How do you deal with it? Lots of wires. No, we have very smart networking people who figure that out. Yeah, and gigabit networks are not that expensive anymore. So networks are not really that slow. Okay, someone asking again, what distribution does Google use? A LFS. What does LFS stand for with Google style? So, no, like I said in the previous one, we have our own custom distribution in the data center, and then Ubuntu on engineers' desktops. Okay, this is a lively crowd here. What's the source control used inside of Google? We use Perforce, actually. I don't think that's secret. That's just, yeah, for historical reasons, we've always used that. Okay, more questions? Okay, I'm going to have to go through a few more of my slides before we... Okay, how did you persuade your mother to use Linux, Gmail, and other open source software? Well, I didn't convince her to use Linux. Maybe I was unclear. I convinced her to use Google and Gmail. So she's an indirect Linux user. So she has a Macintosh. But then my point was that when she uses Google through her web browser, or Gmail through her web browser, then she's really using Linux. Yes. Okay. Well, thank you for all your, and don't keep writing down your questions, but I just give me a couple minutes here. But I'm very glad you took my admonition to heart to ask questions. Well, anyway, so why do we use open source software? This is getting back to the strategy and the business value. It's because it's freedom, flexibility, and control. When building the clusters, we needed control of the operating system, right? Because since at that time they were adopting a very different approach, you couldn't just go out and buy an operating system that did this. They needed to build tools on top of it. They needed to be able to modify it and understand how the operating system worked. And I think the point is, you shouldn't need to ask permission to do something new and interesting. You should just be able to do it. Because the problem is with asking permission is sometimes people say no, and then what do you do? Well, that's a problem. Can you imagine? So say at the beginning they decided they were going to use, I'm not picking on Sun here. It's a great company which has a lot of contributions to open source. But say they decided they were going to use Solaris. Can you imagine the phone call where Larry and Sergey are sitting in their garage and they call up Sun and they say, we're setting up a data center, we're building a cluster, but we're doing it in a different way. So we want to get all the source code to Solaris so we can modify it. Oh, and also we want to understand how it works. So can we have archives of all the emails ever sent between all the engineers for all of their design discussions about Solaris? I just don't really think, Sun's a good company. I don't really think they would say yes to two guys in a garage who ask for all the source code and ask for all the email. And yeah, it never would have happened. So, yes. Okay. Someone says that Linux is far from normal user because there are many versions. What do you think of this? Can you please predict the trend of Linux? There are many versions of Linux. I don't really think that's a problem. There's a few major ones, right? There's Ubuntu, and there's Fedora, and there's SUSE, and then there's a million little ones. But why shouldn't there be a million little ones? If you want to make your own Linux, why not? If there's a Linux with 1 user, or 10 users, or 100 users, that doesn't cause a problem for, I don't think that prevents anything from happening. I think one of the problems with Linux for normal users is maybe lack of applications, or I think one of the big problems, people are just unfamiliar with it. I don't think Linux is really any harder to use than Windows or Mac, but people are just used to Windows and Mac. They know how to do that. If everyone had just learned that, like for example, I went for many years without using anything except for Linux, and I now have a Mac because I wanted to learn about other operating systems. I find the Mac pretty hard to use, just because, it's good, I love my Mac, but I'm confused by it often because I'm just used to X Windows and GNOME and things like that. So I think a very big part of it is just the learning curve. Yes. So anyway, I think if you're doing something innovative with software or computing, really Linux is the natural thing to use. It's just so much easier to innovate and experiment with it than it is with any of the with Windows or Mac or Solaris or any of the existing, because you have the code, and if it's not doing the right thing, you can change it. If there's a bug, you can fix it. But Google's not the only one who's figured this out, right? I think you often read about sort of conflicts between open source and business, and I don't think that's true at all. There is maybe a conflict between open source and the very traditional model of software companies, where you write some software and you put it on a CD and you put the CD in a box, and then the box sits on a shelf and someone goes and buys it and puts it on their computer. And that's an important part of the technology industry, but that's only a very, very small part of the technology industry. And for everybody else, open source is great, and there's really not any conflict with it at all. In fact, we're not the only ones using open source now. Open source is everywhere. In fact, you use open source code every time you talk on your cell phone. There's some sort of piece of open source code in there, I guarantee it. Every time you listen to your MP3 player, the same way, just in embedded systems, open source is just everywhere. You use your PSP or PS2, if you fly on an airplane, you use it. In fact, I know this because when I was flying over here, you know how they have the little screens on the back of the chair, where you can like watch videos or play games. I actually looked at the, I think that software must be a little buggy, because I looked over and in the row next to me there was a kernel panic. I saw the familiar, I knew the form of a kernel panic, and it's automatically rebooted and the video came back. So, yeah, so I'm glad that the people who write the in-flight entertainment software are not the same people writing the navigation software. If you drive in most cars, there's going to be some Linux, or not Linux, but some open source software somewhere in your car. Cars have many microprocessors in them now. You have a lot more computing, vastly more computing power in your car, or even in your phone, than the spaceship that went to the moon. The early Apollo spaceships had. They have very, very primitive computers. When you use a desktop computer, even if you're using Windows, I'm not 100% sure about Vista, but the original Windows networking stack was based on the one from BSD Unix. So there's open source code lurking even in the most surprising places. And maybe even when you're sitting at home doing nothing, you're actually benefiting from open source. Because now most heating and cooling air conditioning systems that have semiconductors in them has open source software in one form or another running in it. So open source keeps you cool and comfortable on a hot sunny day. So there's the big question we ask ourselves in the open source office, is how can Google help open source? Because our sort of philosophy is that open source has been so good for Google, what's good for open source is good for Google, and what's good for open source is good for the internet, because the entire internet is based on open source software. So I should have said, anytime you use the internet somewhere, even if you're talking to a highly proprietary website, probably some piece of software that got your packet from your computer there and back was open source. Let me see. Apologies for the loaded question. What is your opinion of how Google will respond if Microsoft starts suing developers in the open source community? Do you think Google will stand up on behalf of Linux? Well, you know I can't answer that question. But I don't think Microsoft is going to start suing people. That's my personal opinion. I hope they don't. That would, but I'm sorry. The lawyers would yell at me if I said anything about that. And I like our lawyers. Our lawyers are really nice. Chunk servers are part in Google's lab, right? Is this the GFS chunk server? This is a very technical question I don't really understand. So whoever asked me the chunk server question, just talk to me after the talk, and we'll figure that out. This is a little beyond the scope of what I can handle now. So anyway, we think about how can we help open source? Because we think we don't have to necessarily help open source in a way that directly benefits Google that day. If it's good for open source, it's going to come, the good thing will come back to us. Because it helps computer science, it helps the internet, and when these things are helped, it's good for Google. So it's a nice position to be in. We try to be creative about how we do it. The first thing everyone says when they say how can Google help open source, they say, okay, well, give money away. And we're a big company, we've got a lot of money now, we've got a lot more money than any place I've ever worked before, but that's not really the best way to help open source. We can spend money, but you can't just write a check to somebody. Sort of the wonderful thing about open source is kind of self-organizing, right? It sort of does its own thing without a lot of central control. So for Google to go in and try to impose a lot of central control, I think that wouldn't work. That wouldn't work at all. But we really think the best way to help open source is more code. Because the more open source code that's out there, then the easier it is for people to write new open source code, right? Because, well, you've probably had this. If you're working on a program, you decide you want to write a program that does X. and then you suddenly realize, oh, before I can write a program that does X, there's all these other little things I need to do. Maybe things you don't want to worry about, like decoding JPEG images, or doing something with files or file formats. That's no fun to write that stuff, and it's hard work. So when that kind of code is open source, then that lets you take that code, put it in your open source program, and then actually get right to the interesting stuff, the stuff you want to be programming. So what we really try to focus on, and we do spend money. We sponsor conferences, and sometimes we write a check to somebody if there's some particular piece of open source code that we really need. But the main thing we want to do is we want to get more code out there into your hands, so that you can use it and change it and innovate with it, and so that you can write more code. If your code begets code, and the more code we put out there, the more code people are going to write, and then frankly the more code that we have to draw on, so that we can use it and pull it back into Google, and we can write more and better code, and then we can give you more and better code, and it just goes on and on and on, and everybody is hopefully happy. So the question is, how do we try to generate code and put code out into the world? There's a few ways we do that. One is just by participating in open source, and this is one of the things that we in the open source program office do, is we help Googlers. A lot of people at Google have open source experience, but not everybody. So we help them be good open source community members. And we use so much open source internally, and we're constantly, we're using it maybe in different ways than a lot of people are, so we're finding bugs, there's features we maybe need that other people haven't implemented yet, so we implement them. Then we try to push all that out back to the outside world and give it away in the form of patches and contributions. And there's literally hundreds of Googlers contributing to dozens and dozens of projects. Maybe sometimes it's one just little patch, maybe it's a bug fix, maybe it's a whole new feature. So, for example, the Linux kernel. Obviously the Linux kernel is very important. We have lots of smart kernel hackers and engineers working on the Linux kernel to make, the reason we do that is to make our data centers run as fast as possible and as efficiently as possible. And we want to push that out. We want everybody to be able to have Linux work extremely well for them. And then we use, all these things we use extensively, GCC and binutils and autoconf and all these things, sort of the fundamental tools you need to write software. We're writing a lot of software, we're using them, we're making them better, and we want to make them better for you too. But then there's all sorts of things, right? Like MySQL, we just released some things that add performance improvements and sharding and per accounting and lots of things that make MySQL better. They're now released into open source. And then languages like Python and Java, we use a lot of Python and Java inside of Google, and hopefully you'll all stay in here at Guido later today, talk about how wonderful Python is. I love it. All these things, Emacs, Wine, Samba. We have a lot of these developers actually working at Google, and we're using them even if we don't employ the main developers. And we want to help these projects because we use them, we rely on them. If they're better, if we make them better for everybody, they're better for us too. But we don't just want to sort of fix and help existing code. We want to push new code out. If we write an entirely new application, most of the time it doesn't hurt us if everybody in the world has the application, right? I mean, certain things will probably never be open sourced, relating to sort of core web search and things like that. And some things you shouldn't be open sourced, like anti-spam. Right? I mean, if we open sourced our anti-spam, the first thing all the spammers would do would be to download it and then incorporate that in their spam program and make sure that they could get through the filters before we released it. But most of the things we do, if we need a piece of software and we write it, we just want to open source it. So some of the things we've released recently, we have a wide range of different programs. There's a lot more than this that we've released. So the Google Web Toolkit, maybe you've seen, it's the Java to JavaScript compiler that lets you just write a Java program and boom, it works in your web browser now. It's pretty cool. MacFuse, I don't know if you guys know about Fuse. It's really, really interesting. It's like user space file systems, originally for Linux. It basically lets you, before if you wanted to write a new file system for Linux, it was very hard. You had to be a kernel hacker. Now there's this thing where you can just write a program in user space and you sort of say, okay, here's what happens when you, here's how you deal with opening a file. Here's how you deal with reading from a file, or getting directory information. And you just run this program and boom, to Linux it looks like a file system. Well, we ported that to the Macintosh. So now if you have some new idea for a file system, you can implement it in one API. It'll automatically work in both Linux and Macintosh, which is really nice. BreakPad is a crash reporting tool. So you know the little thing where if the program dies, it pops up a little dialogue and says, the program just died, do you want to report it? It's an open source version of that. So unfortunately, open source programs crash too, so maybe you want to add this to your open source program to help collect bug reports and things like that from your users. Google sparse hash. If you're a C++ programmer doing high efficiency things, this is just a very, very efficient implementation of the STL hash classes that we use inside of Google. They're probably much more efficient than the ones you're using now. You should definitely download them. So this is like an algorithms thing, right? We had algorithms experts. Very smart people write this. Why shouldn't everybody in the world have it? Everyone should be using that. LibJingle. This is an example of some code that helps you integrate with a Google product, another thing we like to support. This is for integrating with Google Talk, if you want to write some programs that deal with Google Talks. Google Talk is just Jabber, right? So there's already libraries for dealing with that. But we have some extensions for voice chat and file sharing. So say you want to write an application that lets you do voice chat to someone using Google Talk. You can use LibJingle and connect that to your application. But then there's also some crazy, more exotic stuff too, like the Google Pose Optimizer. This is actually software where if you have a sensor platform with a GPS in it and accelerometers and gyroscopes, it's software to reconstruct the position and orientation of the platform from that data. So now again, most people don't really need that, but say you're a student doing a robotics project and you build a little robot with like a camera on it that rolls around and take pictures, and you want to stitch those together or something. This is a piece of software you can download that makes it a lot easier to do that. So this research type stuff, even if it's only a very narrow audience, there's still a lot of benefit to open sourcing it. And then there's many, many more. So this is sort of our way of pushing code out of Google. But then the other thing, we want to do more than that, right? I mean, that helps, that's good, but we want to help open source developers. We want to help it be easier for them to develop open source. So we try to provide we have a question. Yes?
Does there any more including Google Linux?
I'm sorry,
Does there any more including the Google OS or Google Driver?
Google Linux?
Yes.
You mean like a Linux distribution?
The release. The release pack. The release package.
Okay, so he's asking, are you asking is there a no, there is not a Google Linux distribution. So there's already all sorts of good Linux distributions, right? So I don't think there would really be too much benefit to us releasing one of our own. You use Ubuntu, use Fedora, use SUSE. Those are good. We like those. Yeah. So was that the question? Okay, good. So no, we have not released a Linux distribution. I like Ubuntu. Use Ubuntu. Okay. Oh, thank you. I was wondering where all the questions had gone. We have rate limiting implemented here. Okay, this question I'm going to talk about in a minute, so I'm going to ignore your question. I'm just a few slides away from it. How to get the economic efficiency from open source research? I don't know what you mean by economic efficiency here, right? I mean, this is, in one way, the open source things we do is sort of a guaranteed money loser for Google, right? Because if we spend $1 on open source today, it's not like $1.50 suddenly appears tomorrow that we get, right? But it's indirect. We think how much money we've saved by being able to use open source software on our computers instead of having to pay a bunch of money to some other company every time we add a new computer in our data center. So I think the economic efficiency is huge, but it's hard to measure. So you can't really put a dollar price tag on it. I think that's maybe a problem because people who are, maybe business people who think very much in terms of accounting, if they can't see a very, very tangible benefit, they might not think open source is good. But you save a lot of money. Okay. Do you know OpenOffice? Yes, I know OpenOffice. OpenOffice is very good. What is your opinion in how to develop the OpenOffice in China? I don't really know enough about OpenOffice to comment on that. How many of you use OpenOffice? Raise your hand. Any of you use? Does it have good localization for Chinese language, or not so good? It's good? Okay, that would seem like the kind of thing which Chinese users, where they could make a contribution to improve, Chinese language issues. But other than that, I would suggest talking to an OpenOffice developer. So go to the OpenOffice, if you have this question, go to the OpenOffice mailing list. Mail the mailing list and ask, how can we develop OpenOffice in China? And I'm sure they would have a much better answer than I do. Okay, I have a series of interesting questions here. How old are you? Okay. I am 37 for one more week. So 37. Do you guys develop open source software all day and all night? I'm getting a little old to stay up all night. The last time I tried it, I felt very bad the next day, so I try not to do it too much. All day, yeah, but there's certainly, if you go to if by you guys you mean Google, if you go to the Google office late at night, there's usually, it's pretty easy to find people sitting in front of their keyboards. So someone somewhere is working all day and all night, but I stick to all day personally. How do you think an open sourcer can make a high standard of living? I think the same way everyone makes a high standard of living. Work hard and get a good job. And it's getting easier and easier. I don't know how it is in China, but open source experience is considered very valuable on a resume now. And people with skills in Linux and things like that can command very high salaries in the United States. So I don't know if that's true here, but that's probably the best way to make a high standard of living with open source. How many kinds of licenses have you or your team adopted in publishing your releases? Okay, I didn't put anything in here about licenses because sometimes people don't like technical legal things. The answer on licenses is, our general policy is when we release a piece of software that we write, unless there's some reason why we can't, because of dependencies or whatever, we always use the Apache license. And the reason we like the Apache license is because it's very simple. We give you the code, you can do anything you want with it, except for sue us, basically. So, you can take it, you put it in an open source project, put it in a closed source project, we don't care. If you take our software and invent some way to make $1 million with it, great, good for you, we don't mind. We want you to make $1 million, that's good. Now sometimes but we don't really have a prejudice against any license. Well, if some software needs to be GPL for some reason or LGPL, we'll release it under that license. The main thing we don't like is we don't like all the kind of weird, funny little licenses because that makes it very complicated, right? So we try to limit ourselves to just sort of like the big popular licenses. And sometimes projects try to invent their own little license. I think that creates big problems.
Could you please stop adding the questions to Jon? We should let Jon finish.
Okay. So what I'm going to put these. I'm going to put these here. Yeah, just keep writing them down, and I'll just finish. I'll go through my slides quickly, and I don't have that many left because I wanted to answer a lot of questions. And if we don't have time for your questions, I'd be very glad to talk to you after the talk too. So I'll just keep going here. Yeah, keep writing your questions. This is very good. So one of the things we did is we wanted to make it easier for people to start their own open source project and thus create more code. So we created we wanted something that's scalable and fast and googly and nice. So we created project hosting on Google Code to give you everything you need to collaborate with other people across the internet. The main tools on there is version control via Subversion. A bunch of the people who wrote Subversion, which is a replacement for CVS, a very nice version control system. They work at Google now, so they adapted Subversion's server to integrate with Bigtable and other pieces of Google infrastructure. So now we have what's probably the world's most scalable version control system, and you can all use it. We also provide a download area where you can upload files and users can download them, and an issue and a bug tracker so if people find a problem in your code. It's sort of like like Bugzilla, but I think it's nicer, it's simpler. And also a wiki. So it used to be if you were just an individual and you wanted to start an open source project, you need all these things, but maybe you don't have a server, or maybe you have to pay for a server somewhere. Here you can just, if you go right now, you don't have to get any approval or anything. You can just go and in 5 minutes create a new open source project, and boom, you have the version control, you have the wiki, you have everything you need. And we have, I should have checked how many projects there are now, but there's lots and lots and lots of projects on project hosting now. And I think it's a really great, and there's some really interesting ones. So just here's the URL, or just, I hate putting URLs on slides. Just type project hosting Google code into Google and you'll find it. That's easy to remember anyway. And then the sort of final thing I want to talk about is the Summer of Code, which there was a question about before. What about the Summer of Code? And this is a really great program, and one that we really love and we're excited about. How many of you know about the Summer of Code? No, not everyone. Okay, so I'll give a quick explanation. What Summer of Code is it's a virtual internship program to allow students to write open source software, but be able to get money for it. Instead of having to maybe over the summer when you're not in your studies, instead of having to take another job, your job can be to write open source software. Here's how it works. Google, we partner with existing open source projects like Apache Software Foundation, Python, Subversion. There's a whole bunch of them. This year there's 130 of them that we're working with. This is again, we want to help these projects. These are projects that we think are good and valuable. And there's a whole very wide range of different kinds of projects. And what you do then, students, you write a proposal of what you want to do to improve that project. Maybe it's add a new feature, maybe it's do performance analysis and figure out how to make the program faster. It can be all sorts of different kinds of things. But the student writes proposals. It's like a grant application, saying what they want to do. Then the organizations, they get all of these and they decide. They pick the ones that they like the most. So we don't choose because we don't know. I mean, I don't personally know what the most important thing Python needs now, but the Python developers do. So they're the ones who can make the best decision about which students have made the best proposal. So the mentors, existing open source developers from those projects, review the proposals and they choose which students to accept. And we give the projects a cert based on how many we're going to do that year and other factors and the size of the project. We give them a certain number of slots. So we say, okay, you can take 5 students to a project. You can take 10 students. Maybe a small project, we say you can take 1 student. Then they take the top 5 or the top 10 of the applications they get. And then you, the student, you work with that person who is your mentor, and you are part of the open source community for summer. You're on the mailing lists, you contribute your code, and then you actually implement your project. And hopefully by the end of the summer you're finished, and the whole point is it has to be open source software. It has to go back into the existing open source software and make it better. And Google pays you to do this. So what are the benefits to the student? First of all, you get real-world experience. You learn not only how to write software, but how to write software collaborating with other people over the internet. The other thing you gain is auditable experience. What I mean by that is it's experience that everyone can see because it's all open source. So, like everyone at Google as an engineer, I'm involved with hiring people. So I see lots of resumes all the time where people list their student projects. And when on your resume, everyone sounds like a genius. Everyone writes, I did this, and I did that, and I did that. But, I don't know. You kind of have to ignore that stuff because you don't know if it worked, you don't know if it had bugs. But if you work on an open source project, you can give a URL on your resume, and the person can actually look, and they can look in the version control. They can see every single commit you made. They can look at your code. They can look at you on the mailing list. They can see, do you work well with other people? This is information that's very useful to have if you're trying to decide who to hire and who not to hire. And having open source experience where you can really check it out, that's a very useful thing to have if you want to get a job at Google. I don't know if anyone here wants a job at Google, but it doesn't hurt. We like that. You get a really nice t-shirt every year if you complete the program. But more importantly, you get money. And I was thinking about this, and see, this is the kind of interesting thing. This is what you call an arbitrage opportunity for students in the developing world. Is we pay an amount of money to make it attractive to people who live in the United States and Europe. So you get $500 for being accepted, and this is based on the exchange rate they gave me at the airport last week, so I don't know how accurate that is. You get $2,000 at the middle of the summer, so if you don't do any work, then we kick you out of the program, right? At the middle of the summer, we talk to the mentors, and we say, how is this person doing? Are they doing their work? Are they communicating well? And if they are, we give you $2,000. And then you get if you finish your project, then you get another $2,000, and that's $4,500, which is, I think that's a pretty good. I think that's a pretty good wage. It's a pretty good wage in the United States for a student, and the cost of living is definitely lower here. And the best thing is you can have this opportunity. All you need is your internet connection. You don't have to go to the United States. You don't even have to be in Beijing. You can be off in a small city somewhere, maybe where there's not a lot of opportunities for internship with interesting stuff working on software. So I think there's a lot of benefits for the students. And there's a lot of benefits for Google too. I mean, the main one is just that it helps to build a healthy open source ecosystem. By training students in learning about open source and how to be part of an open source community, that means there's going to be more open source developers, that means there's more open source code today, and more open source developers tomorrow. And it's a great way for us to meet students all over the world. And we like that. We love talking to people, and we love meeting smart people and giving them jobs. So I'm not going to lie, that's one of the reasons why we do this program. But it's the most important thing is helping open source, and it's really also about giving something back. Because like I said, Google is this big successful company now, but it wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Linux, or it would be here in a very, very different form. And we really do feel that puts an obligation on us to contribute back to open source because we've benefited so much from it. So this year, this is the third year we've done the Summer of Code. We had 6,179 applicants this year, which is a lot. And we chose 900 students. That works out to, we're spending $4.5 million in open source. If you check my math, you'll think I'm wrong, because we're giving, the mentor organization gets $500 for every student. So we're spending basically $5,000 times 900, and there's 131 mentoring organizations this year. It gets bigger, the Summer of Code gets bigger every year, and hopefully it'll be bigger next year. And then just a quick word about the breakdown. The distribution of students, you have to be a student, either a college student or a graduate student. If you've graduated, it's too late, sorry. Most of the students are undergraduates, but we have people in master's programs, also people in PhD programs. Now this is hard to interpret because most of the people in it are undergraduates, but most students are undergraduates. So I think there's a fairly level, if you kind of think of it in those terms, statistically, I think we have a pretty uniform breakdown that's representative of the number of students out there, but I'm not really sure. And this is for the 2006 program. The expected graduation year was 2007. So this means that most of our students are a few years into their schooling, but not all of them. Some of them are just starting out. And not all of them are computer science students. Probably most are, but we have students from all sorts of different disciplines, both engineering and non-engineering disciplines, who do this program. So it's really open to anybody who can write some code and who's interested in being part of open source. And then the distribution by region. Most of the people in Summer of Code in 2006 who finished it were in Europe. Open source is very big in Europe and very well known and understood. Next came North America, the United States, and Canada. Asia came next. Then we had some people in South America. Open source is very big in Brazil, which is very exciting. It's great. And then we had a handful of people in Africa and the Middle East, but not nearly enough. So then, of course, the key question comes, how about Chinese participation? Not as much as you would think. So one of the things I wanted to have happen here is to get more Chinese involved in Summer of Code next year. Now, in 2006, there were 11 students in China who participated. Now, I think there are some who studied Chinese students in the United States who also took part in this. I heard there were more of some of those, but I'm just counting people who are here in China now. So it was 11 in 2006, and it was 22 into this year in 2007 have been accepted. So, you see a pattern here. My first thing I was going to say, next year there should be 44. But I sort of stumbled, I didn't know this, but I sort of randomly stumbled across the fact that 44 is a very unlucky number. I'm happy I knew that. So I don't want to put bad luck onto the summer of code. So I changed it to 45, which I hear is a good number. And I was, is 45 okay? 45 okay? All right, I guess 45 is all right. So my hope is that maybe I can come back next year and we'll have 45 or even a bigger number on this slide. And then maybe I can, I don't know, hopefully 88 is a lucky number, right? Maybe I'll say 88 next year. But I will consult my numerologist before giving any talks. So I think, unfortunately, Summer of Code for this year has started, but it's never too early to start thinking about Summer of Code 2008. I mean, we're not officially doing it, it's not officially announced yet, but, I think we all certainly hope it's going to happen. So, you should tell your friends who are students. How many of you are students in one form or another? Okay, we've got a fair number of students, and probably a lot of you who aren't students know some students. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues that this program exists. Some people, it's never too early to start thinking about, getting involved in open source, because your application is more likely to be accepted if the project knows you, rather than if you're just a stranger who shows up. So get involved now. Find a project you're interested in, and start working on it, and start thinking about your application now, and next year apply to Summer of Code, and let's get lots of students in China in Summer of Code. And then more generally, I think the question we have to all ask ourselves is how can we all, both Google and ourselves and all of you, how can we help open source in China? And we're going to have a panel after lunch, which is talking about building open source communities in China. And any ideas that you have about how to help open source in China, or things you think Google could do to help open source in China, we would really love to do that. So this is my last slide. So there's probably, I hope there's a giant stack of questions. So I'm going to answer as many questions as I can now. And if I don't get to your question, I'm sorry. But talk to me afterwards, or come to the panel if you have a more general open source questions. We'll have plenty more time to answer your questions. Okay. Does Google Talk use open source version of libjingle? I don't know. I assume it does. I would be pretty surprised if it didn't. But yeah, I mean, it must. I'm sure it does. I mean, the Google Talk developers wrote it, so it would be kind of strange if it didn't. Does Google use virtualization technology on PC servers like Xen, Jail, VMware? No. Okay, do you use Windows in your work? I don't. Some people at Google use Linux. I mean, for example, we have engineers who write, Windows applications, right? Like Google Earth for Windows and Google Desktop for Windows. So those guys use Windows. And then some of our people who are like business people and, secretaries and salespeople, they use Windows because that's what they're used to, that's what they like. The philosophy in Google is use whatever operating system you like and whatever operating system you need to do your job. And so some engineers use Windows for maybe their laptop because they like that, or there's some application they want to run. But I personally, I don't use Windows. Windows is fine. It's gotten a lot better over the years. If you like Windows, use Windows. You just use what you like and what gets the job done for you. Why are you so exciting? It's hard for me to really say why I'm so exciting, but I'm assuming this means why are you so excited? What does Google bring you? Well, I mean, I have to admit I am excited about Google. I'm excited about open source at Google, and the reason why, I mean, Google is a wonderful place to work. It's a wonderful atmosphere. It's full of smart people who are very passionate, who are doing interesting things, and it's incredibly open source friendly. Which is why I went to work there, because I thought, Google's this big, powerful company that loves open source. What better way to help open source than to go to Google and see what I can do from inside of Google? And people, everyone's very friendly towards open source, and we're very committed to saying yes, right? I mean, there's very few obstacles put up before us in terms of being able to help open source or release open source code. We don't have to have a bunch of arguments with people about why open source is good. Everyone believes open source is good, right? You know, if someone argues with us, we can just send them to Larry, right? And Larry likes open source. So, you know, and you know, Sergey, everyone at the top, everyone all throughout Google loves open source, and they want to see it succeed, and they think it's important that open source succeeds. So that's a very exciting thing, and it's yeah, that's why I'm so exciting. Okay, we got another one. Can we do everything on Linux that can also be done on Windows? If so, what's the difference between them? No, you can't do everything on Linux that you can do on Windows. You can't do everything on Windows that you can do on Linux. If you think of it in terms of running certain applications, right? I mean, if you want to run, well, I guess in one sense you could always use like VMware or something like that to run. If you want to use Microsoft Office, you can't do that on Linux, right? Unless you use virtualization. But in terms, I think if you're a software developer or a web developer, and there's some, you're implementing a program, or you're a student doing research, writing a program, doing that kind of thing. I think from a developer standpoint, everything you can do on Linux, you can do everything you need to do on Linux, right? You might do it in a slightly different way than you would do it on Windows. Maybe there's some Windows API that you can't use, but I think it would be very rare there would not be a corresponding API on Linux. If so, what's the difference between them? The difference between them, that Linux is free and Windows you pay a lot of money for. So I don't like paying a lot of money for things I can get for free. Okay, does Google plan to develop a Linux version for Google Desktop? No comment. Do you want to have one? Yeah, that would be great. What do you think of the agreement between Novell and Microsoft? They can do whatever they want to do, right? I mean, it's, one of the things people, here's the thing, people always want to make it a fight between Google and Microsoft. And if you read articles, journalists like to make it sound like we're all in a big fight. But we don't think about it that way. We just want to focus on doing things well, and Microsoft should focus on doing things well, and then you guys decide which one you like the most. That's what the fight should be. The fight should be over making the best thing and making users happy. And if we make users happier, then we win. And if Microsoft makes users happier, then they win. And that's the way it should be. And if Novell makes users happy, then they win too. But the most important thing is that users are happy. Okay, the Free Software Foundation is asking people to write an open source alternative to the Google Earth client. I didn't know that. What do you think about that? That's fine. If you want to write a Google Earth client, that's you should do that. Now the one problem is you can't use the Google Earth data, but there is actually free satellite imagery data that you can use. In fact, there is an open source version of Google Earth, or a product like Google Earth. I think it's called Whirlwind. So yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I like Google Earth, but if you're a person who only wants to run open source software, then don't use Google Earth. That's fine. Okay, so this one has a bunch of Chinese on it, so okay, but I think it's asking about Picasa for Linux. There is Picasa for Linux. So why does some Google software not have a Linux version, e.g. Picasa? Okay, first of all, there is a Linux version of Picasa. It's pretty good. I'm sorry? So what? I mean, look here, if the reason that there's not a Linux version, a pure Linux version of something, it's probably because it's a lot of work to write it. And, we're not going to make any money off of it, right? So I think the most important thing is giving someone a piece of software that works and isn't terrible. Now, if Picasa running under Wine is creating a problem of some kind, that's a bug, right? We should fix the bug if it doesn't integrate well with the rest of your desktop. But who cares if it's running under Wine? The main thing is that, that's kind of a political thing. We don't really care about political things. We want to make users happy. And very few users care if it's running under Wine or not. And if you do, don't use it. Use FSpot. That's a very nice program for photos on Linux. Okay, why do some Google apps not have the Linux version? Again, it's because it's mostly a question of we only have so many engineers. We have to make some decisions. For most client apps, we're always going to do the Windows version first because we want to maximize the impact of anything we do. But we all love Linux and we all want Linux versions of all the programs. So in a perfect world, we would support all platforms equally, but we're not living in a perfect world. Why does Google choose Linux, not FreeBSD? I don't know, historical reasons. It's, FreeBSD is good. If you like FreeBSD, use FreeBSD. Do you have any plans to open source famous products such as Gmail, Google Docs Reader? So, now, okay, why would it, see, this is the thing, I think it would be probably impossible to release an open source version of Gmail that you could run on your own server. And the reason why is our big applications, or even things, our big pieces of infrastructure like Bigtable, they're very, very closely tied to our platform and our hardware and our infrastructure. So if we open sourced the Gmail, the only people who could actually run it would be people who also owned Google data centers. And the set of people who own Google data centers is pretty small right now. It's in fact a set of 1, and we already have the source code. So, this is the thing. We want to open source as many things as possible. So, but the other problem with open sourcing very, very big things at the top of our stack is they have a million dependencies on things at the bottom of our stack. So most of the code that, with that sort of a pure thing that we use in our products that we're open sourcing, we have to start at the bottom. So just things like, sparse hash, or like we recently open sourced our command line flag parsing library, which might seem very, very boring to you, but all sorts of, I can't tell you how many times we've not been able to open source some other package because it depended on our command line flag library. So, we have to release all these little building blocks and then we can start releasing bigger things. Is there any way our end users can access structured data in Google apps such as Gmail, Calendar in something way? Well, yeah, this is one of the reasons we have APIs, right? So if you want to access the data in a structured way, you should leave this room and you should go over to the other track, which is about APIs. And this is the great thing about web services and APIs is you can use those on any platform, right? It doesn't matter. You just need to be able to, make an HTTP request, and everything supports that now. Okay, you've had your hand up for a while, yes.
And I heard many Googlers feel free in Google. So, but what's the situation in this department? Just like finance and accounting, security and confidential.
I'm sorry, what you use? Okay.
And is many Googlers feel free in Google.
Feel free,
yes,
okay.
Yes.
You mean like happy free?
But what's the situation in this department, finance accounting?
I
mean finance accounting, Google's feel free too.
Oh, you mean does it use free software?
Not software. That's the feeling.
Okay, I don't really. Yeah, why don't you guys talk about the question? Oh, we have 48 seconds left. How can you control the quality of open source projects? Do more tests or just let bugs happen, then fix them? No, write tests, write unit tests. That's the best. Fix the bugs when you find them too, but tests are very important for software quality. Let's see, this one was first. Okay, we have 29 seconds. Now Baidu is more popular in China. Google pay more attention to the world. Now, how do you think the competition between Baidu and Google? Well, I think competition is good. Hopefully, hopefully the fact that Baidu exists has made Google work harder in China, and hopefully Google will get better, and then Baidu will have to work harder, and then Baidu will get better, then Google will have to work harder, and the people who will win will be you, because there'll be better tools available. So competition is good. Okay, this is blinking at me, so I have one question I didn't get to answer. Sorry, if you want to talk to me afterwards, I would love to talk to you. And thanks a lot, everyone, for coming.